inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joy of story. Our Kids Read program offers immersive reading experiences for children, and we support early career writers with our first novel prize and our Emerging Writers Fellowship. And our 2024 First Novel Prize long list was just announced today. It's 25 amazing first novels, so check them out if you need reading recommendations. Visit our site, sign up for our mailing list, and follow us on social media. And to support our work creating a home for readers and writers here in Brooklyn, please consider becoming a member so that you're tuned into all of our activities and come back and see us soon. We have some, okay, anyway, after the conversation, sorry, editing on live time here. After the conversation, we will have an audience Q&A, and if you're here, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you because we have an audience who are watching online as well. And if you're on the live stream, you can add your question to the chat at any time, and we'll read that from the back of the room. How many of you have read Jose Donoso's work already? Oh, well, I'm thrilled to introduce the translation of The Obscene Bird of Night with the thrilling author Hari Kunzru. It's going to be such a great talk. Please welcome them to the stage.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. So my name's Hari Kunzru. I'm a novelist and sort of newish Donoso fan. And it falls to me to introduce Megan McDowell, who has translated a lot of the most important Latin American writers working today. Her translations have won the National Book Award for Translated Literature, the English Pen Award, the Premio Valle Inclán, and 2 O. Henry Prizes. They've been nominated 4 times for the International Booker Kirkus Prize, and many, many short story prizes. She's from Richmond, Kentucky, and lives in Santiago, Chile. So welcome. Very pleased to be having this conversation with you. I wanted to say, kind of on a personal note, I realized, as I was kind of researching for this event, how much of your writing I've read. Latin American writers like Samantha Schweblin, Alejandra Zambra, Mariana Enriquez, Lina Merane, all these people who I love in translation. I realized it's your prose I'm reading, so thank you so much for that.
Thank you for reading.
And so now we've done the kind of fun and friendly stuff. Now we turn to total darkness.
Yeah.
We turn to the grotesque and to secrets. I mean, Donoso is one of these great figures of the Latin American boom, but he is very little known in the Anglosphere. So I thought maybe we could start off by you giving just a sort of brief bit of positioning to kind of get a sense of who he is and what this book is, and then we'll talk about
we'll get
the
into
thing.
So first of all, thank you all for coming. I was really curious to see how many people raised their hands who had read.
Yeah, we couldn't
Donoso
see
before.
from backstage. Yeah.
And thank you also for being here. And so Donoso, he's grouped in with the boom, which I think probably everyone here knows what it is, but in the 60s and 70s, it's kind of partially a marketing concept by Carmen Balcells in Spain to promote the writers that you all associate with Latin America. Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Cortázar and Vargas Llosa and Pedro Juan Rulfo, maybe a little bit. I don't know.
Rulfo's a weird. People. Donoso was arguing whether Rulfo was part of the boom.
Yeah,
or not.
I'm not so sure about that.
The Cuban whose name is like immediately
Carpentier. And Fuentes, right? So Donoso is not necessarily the first tier that we think of with the boom, but he was friends with all those guys, and he knew them. And in Chile, and in Latin America, and in Spain, he's pretty widely read. Like this book hasn't been out of print at all since it was published.
I heard that they were at one point they were teaching this book in schools.
Oh yeah, in Chile, people
which
read
seems-
him in school, in high school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a controversial choice.
Yes, yeah. But I mean, there are very few people in Chile who don't know who he is. So yeah,
So he's a grand figure, but he's kind of absent from the discussion here, and he was a kind of a troubled man, I think it's fair to say, and we could go back maybe in a while and talk about how those personal troubles kind of impacted this book. But this is one of these projects that was like a completely consuming thing for this writer for the best part of a decade. I mean, he started this like circa 1960.
60. Yeah, the 1959 I think was when he first got the first image or idea. Yeah, and he worked on it all through the 60s, and it was published in 1970. So.
And then it did get published here in 1972 or three.
Yeah.
It seemed to get quite a splash. I found a big Robert Coover review from
that is
the
a great
Times,
review.
and very useful for somebody thinking about it. And Coover's somebody, and those big sort of maximalist North American writers like Coover and Barth seem to connect to what Donoso's doing. There's certainly a kind of I don't know, family resemblance there. But I mean, like where even to start with this? It's like a cheese dream. This book, it's
like a what?
A cheese dream. You know, eating too much cheese before you go to bed.
Gotcha.
I don't mean it's cheese. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's. I guess you could start with the central character. You could start with the place, maybe. I mean, it's one of these books which takes place in a building which is as much a character as any of the characters.
Yeah, like I have spent a lot of. To me, it's hard to talk about this book without talking about the character of Donoso, like his biography and where the ideas for the book came from, because he wrote two pieces. One that's the afterword of the book in Spanish, that's kind of a biography of the book. And the other one is in English that was published in the Review of Contemporary Fiction. And those are really interesting because they overlap, but they're not exactly the same. And you can kind of see there's a lot of Donoso that is kind of myth-making. The mythology of the book is really important. We can talk about that. There's a central myth of the book that Donoso invented. But he's also in his own diaries and his own writing about this book, I think, kind of trying to create his own myth. And so he talks about certain images that inspired the book. The first one was this image where he was out on the street in Santiago in 1959, and he was waiting at a red light to cross the street, and this really fancy black car pulled up. This is a time where there's still horse-drawn carriages and trolleys and stuff in Santiago, and there was this really big, beautiful car that pulled up, and it had a blonde, good-looking chauffeur, and in the back was a boy who was very well-dressed and very deformed. And that was the first image. He started thinking about what's this boy's story, and and about his parents who, have given him all of this comfort and this car and his clothes, but and he lives in this probably separate world. So that gave rise to the first book, which was called the El Último Azcoitia, the last of the Azcoitia is the name of the family name. And he thought that was the book that he was writing.
So it was just going to be that. And there is one of the strands of the story is this patriarch of an old established family, desperate for a son and heir. Finally, very belatedly, a boy is born and is terribly, terribly deformed. And the choice that the father's first impulse is he wants to kill the child.
Right.
But instead, he does this extraordinary, fantastical thing of deciding to create a world around this boy, who's just known as Boy, that will be populated entirely by the word that he uses is monsters.
We have to just say monsters because that's the word.
And so boy is taken to this remote place, and set up with servants and a kind of social world, and there's this sort of, it's amazing, these sort of auditions for the most monstrous are held, and so the first class monsters are those who surround him. But in case he kind of accidentally gets out, it reminded me, it's a little like a sort of weird version of the story of the Buddha. He's been kept so isolated. He's never seen death. He's never seen disease and so on. And when he goes out into the world, it's terribly shocking, and he becomes the Buddha.
And everyone is naked.
Yes,
and he has the idea is that he has no perception of time. So he lives in this kind of grotesque version of Eden, where there's no perception of himself as deformed, because everyone around him is deformed, and everything that he sees is just what is.
And he lives happily like that. But there is one person in this world who appears deformed because he's the only non-deformed person, who is this very slippery character who seems to sort of mutate in various ways in the book. We meet him as El Mudito, a deaf mute, who's a kind of, the servant who's the only person who knows his way around all the corridors and courtyards and back ways of this sprawling building, La Rinconada, which has been a convent and a
So La Rinconada is where the monsters live. The Casa de Ejercicios. So we should maybe talk about the places, because in Donoso, and not just in this book, but in all of Donoso, houses are very important, right? And he has this idea of a house is creating an internal universe that's separate from the world. And one of the main ones in this book is called the Casa de Ejercicios. That used to be a convent, and it's now been consecrated. And it's where the Chilean high society sends their servants when they become too old to be useful. So there's a group of old women who live there in abject poverty, and then there's also a group of 5 orphans who live there, and there's a couple nuns. And then there's Mudito, our main character. Our main character, Mudito, who cannot speak, and he waits on them. He's kind of their servant. And then trying to summarize the plot of this novel, like I'll just go down into all these little corridors, and then I'll get stuck. And
part of it is, we should say that there are things that are happening that are not internally consistent. There are like these planes of narrative, and like El Mudito sort of slides from being one kind of. It could all be one. There, you can kind of squint and make it kind of logical whole. But part of the strangeness and pleasure of the book is the way that you think you have a handle on what's going on, and then suddenly it slides out of your grasp, and you're in a slightly different story, and the terms and conditions have changed. That gives it this dreamlike quality, which I find really fascinating from a kind of technical point of view. And it's destabilizing and it's disturbing.
Right, I would call it maybe nightmarish more than dreamlike.
Fair.
It's important to realize that he did start out thinking he was writing 2 novels. One was this story about the great, prócer, upper class, man of state, and the other was this book about the abject old women who were living in poverty in this casa. And then the characters started to visit each other. There was a yellow dog in one, and then there was a yellow dog in the other. And then, the character of the old crone in one became the old crone in another. And the mythology behind them started to become kind of reflected back.
There's endless doubling, and things can turn into their opposites in some ways as well. There's plenty of witchcraft and magic and transformation from that point of view. But there's this sort of the kind of foundation myth of the whole establishment is there was this 18th century girl who was either a saint or a witch,
Right.
and it seems totally indeterminate as to kind of whether, which side of the good evil dyad she was on. But in any case, they decided she needed to be locked away, and she becomes a sort of spirit of place in this labyrinthine building. I mean, and all these things sort of end up as metaphors for writing as well. I mean, this is a book. This is a book about writers and discovery of self and the difficulty of telling stories.
Right. Yeah, it is. But it's also, I mean, it's also a larger metaphor. Like he talks about how this whole process of writing was a struggle to find the voice. And to him, the voice itself is a metaphor for a system of values. And that's what you have to read this whole book and kind of let go of what you're expecting from literature, from a story, from a novel, and try and get into his personal mythology and understand the system of values that can only be communicated through this novel.
Can you say something about that system of values?
Well,
no, to read the book.
Yeah, basically, you have to read the book. But he's really. He does a couple things. He's dealing with history on one hand and kind of the subconscious and really what turns into paranoia on the other hand. So it's like a very external world versus an internal world. And you see that with the Embunche, you see that with the experiences of each of these, La Rinconada, where the monsters live, which is its own society. And it's like a circus funhouse mirror of Chilean society.
Because they're doing all these very sort of social things. They're having kind of balls where they all dress in white, and there are love affairs, and there are all the kind of the doings of high society are, as you say, are kind of mirrored in this.
Right.
So you mentioned the Mbunche. We broached the central kind of horrific image of the Mbunche, which I think we should explain.
So Donoso talks about how, so when he was a child growing up, he heard all of these stories told around a campfire, these kind of mythological creatures. One of which was the chonchon, which is a disembodied head that floats around and wreaks havoc. And the other was the Embunche, which comes from Chiloé, which is in the south of Chile. It's an archipelago, which has a lot of really fascinating mythological creatures. And the Embunche is a child who is kidnapped, stolen by witches, and they mutilate the child. They sew all of its orifices shut so it can't speak or anything, and they take one of its limbs and attach it to its back, so it hobbles around on 3 limbs.
Yeah, the head is reversed.
Oh, they turn its head around backwards too, and that is it.
It's not good.
Yeah, and it is. There are some things that don't make sense. Like it only feeds on maybe goat's blood in some, and children's blood in others. How does it feed? Don't know, because it's all sewn up. But it's not real.
I mean, there's some. I mean, it's not real. It's not real.
Yeah,
it's not real. Right? No, no.
So, and the witches use the Embunche. It's both a fetish and it gives them advice. How? Don't know. And it guards the entrance.
But it just grunts,
right?
Isn't it?
Yeah, and it guards the entrance to their caves.
I realised that Bruce Chapman managed to. There's a bit in Patagonia where he found that story and he tells it. Which is, interesting. He's very good at kind of very quickly feigning knowledge of places, and that was one of the stories that he told in Patagonia. As an aside,
right?
So the Mbunche is this figure, and El Nudito is at certain points concerned that he's going to be made into one of those by the old women.
One could say that he is. I think that basically El Nudito is an Embunche. in different extents at different parts of the novel. Especially at the end, he's so well.
So he's just more literally sewn into a sack.
But he has this fragmented identity that's always kind of struggling to get out. He's struggling to write at different points.
There's a version of him who's Umberto Peñalosa, who's a student writer who has a kind of ambition and then finds himself kind of taken away from that and locked up. Like he falls away from that identity into being maybe not actually a deaf mute, maybe just pretending to be a deaf mute. Or I mean, you can see the way we're talking about this. Everything is quite provisional and things slide, and it's very hard to speak in this definitive way. And that's part of the strangeness of the book, but also its pleasure as well is this slipperiness and this multiplicity that even makes it quite hard to do summary or paraphrase.
It is almost impossible to summarize this book. But the central myth that Donoso creates from these legends that he heard as a child has to do with a rich landowner who has a daughter. And the daughter is either a witch or a saint, as you say, and she has an old nana who takes care of her, who teaches her domestic talents, but also teaches her witchcraft, we come to realize. And there's a moment where the old landowner comes to confront her and the witch and opens the door. And as he opens the door, he's wearing a poncho, and it hides what's going on in the room. We never know. Is the witch a witch? Is the girl a saint? Is she a witch? It's like one of those sort of Schrodinger's cat kind of situations where it never collapses onto a single. And that image to me is really important because that's what power does. It shields. And there's a lot in this book that is about shielding. It's about like the houses are both protecting and cutting you off. The Mbunche is in a way protected and also cut off. And one of the things we need to talk about is that this edition of the book is putting in things that were cut from that original translation in 1970.
Right. So this is where you come into this story. Is that so? This book had this quite complicated publication history. In that the Spanish edition comes out, and then it's decided it will be translated into English, and then the American editors start working with Donoso and suggesting cuts,
right? And
he's not altogether happy about that. So maybe say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I'll circle back. Yeah. So one of the things that is really important for this book comes from an episode in Donoso's life, which was he had a bleeding ulcer and had to have surgery. And while he had a terrible reaction to morphine, and he had a fit of madness. And when he came back, he found this voice, the structure for the book. He said all these things that had been unclear to him before now made sense. But he had hallucinated things like his doctors were taking his blood out, sending it to Vietnam, returning dirty blood for him to process with his body. It was a totally paranoid hallucination. That's in the book. There's this whole section where Umberto Mudito is in the hospital and he has these experiences with Dr. Asula where they're taking out his organs and So the English language editors wanted to cut all of that out. And Donoso said, no, that's key. That's one of the most important parts, and we can't cut that out, but we can take some things out. So they cut out a few of the parts with Dr. Asula, for example, those parts in the hospital. They also wanted to cut out a lot of the parts with the monsters that have to do with what they called tinselly, kind of cheap. There's a lot of talk of makeup, clothes, shoes, brands, the brand of the teas that they're drinking. So it creates this environment that the monsters live in where they're also very, they pay a lot of attention to appearance and to how they present themselves. And the editors didn't like that. They wanted to cut out all of that. And I think that maybe they thought it was a little superficial. I'm not sure. But to Donoso, that was really important because that's another layer. It's a mask. You know, to him, appearance was really important. So he agreed to some of those cuts. And then there was another, in the casa, hopefully you guys know what I mean when there's another setting where El Mudito lives with the old crones. He becomes obsessed with a little Swiss chalet, a music box. And that's another instance of shrinking things down. It's a symbol of protection. It's shrinking down the humans until they become a toy.
Yeah.
And they cut out all references to that. They also cut out all references to Fidel Castro. And
because you're expecting the Fidel Castro section.
Yeah, and Cuba. And to Donoso, it's really interesting. Chris Wade, my editor at New Directions, went and did some research in the archives. And there's Donoso was talking about how he sees those two images as two extremes. So the Swiss chalet is like the house within the house within the house. And it's a symbol of protection. And then the Castro and the bearded revolutionaries is a symbol of what's going on in the world. It's the big wide world, and it's modernity and contemporary life. So the editors took both of those things out. So that's an example of things that have been added back in here. Mm-hmm. And but the references to the Cuban revolutionaries come in the form of newspaper that's it's used to wallpaper the walls. So it is literally part of the house. It's part of the thing that's closing them in.
This is one of those books where human bodies and domestic environments are very interchangeable, aren't they? I mean, as you say, there's this kind of layering, but it's all about boundaries, and it's all about when the boundaries are secure and and impermeable, and then there's horrific permeability. I mean, Umberto manages to kind of find it sort of upside in being an Mbunche, in that he's very kind of cocooned and is protected.
It's in a way, the Mbunche is a human body before it's born. It can't speak, it can't communicate, but it also is safe in a way. It's an unformed identity. So a lot of the book has to do with Mudito trying to figure out what his identity is.
And then against that, there's the whole Dr. Azula and the dismemberment and stealing organs, and it kind of what happens when you can't control your boundaries and you're kind of you're spread out, and again the things turning into their opposites, things kind of sliding out of control.
Yeah, after when Donoso was in the hospital, when he had this kind of breakdown, he started raving, and he had all these hallucinations, and he had all these fears, and he somehow had a witness who was sitting there, this other professor who was a professor of logic. He wrote down all of his
Logic is kind of perfect.
He was a logic professor. And then afterwards, he went back to the notes and he said, there is a structure to these ravings. There's this kind of, he called it paralogical structure to it, and that made a lot of sense for Donoso. He took that structure and incorporated it into the novel.
I found some reference to him as having something different from that, as having a kind of stylistic breakthrough with another writer whose name I'm blanking on, who he reads and realizes that you could use the irrational as a kind of organizing principle, like he'd been a kind of relinquishing of certain sorts of rational connection, got him to the place he needed to be in order to make this thing happen.
That sounds a lot like what happened here.
I mean, maybe the title is an interesting, because he teaches Don also teaches in the US quite a lot, and he's definitely somebody who likes English language, literature, and the title, The Obscene Bird of Night, is the James. It's from the James family. Like, I mean, it's the
James Senior.
Yeah.
I can read it.
Please.
Every man who has reached even his intellectual teens begins to suspect that life is no farce, that it is not genteel comedy even, that it flowers and fructifies, on the contrary, out of the profoundest tragic depth of the essential dearth in which its subject's roots are plunged. The natural inheritance of everyone who is capable of spiritual life is an unsubdued forest where the wolf howls and the obscene bird of night chatters.
And that's
Henry James Sr.
It's good to tell your kids that.
Yeah, that's no, it is. It's a letter to his sons Henry and William. So.
Just letting you know, son.
Yeah.
It's an unsubdued forest where the wolf howls and the obscene bird of night chatters. And I mean, that word chatters, I mean, there is a sort of busyness to this prose. There's a kind of excess to it, and there's a kind, I mean, there are times when it becomes overwhelming and you have to put it down and go and touch grass. And but inside this kind of clattering, chattering, kind of mutating world, it's horrifying, but it's also fascinating. I mean, the word monster has these double connotation. The monster is the thing that is shown, and there's the Latin origins of the word. It is displayed, and at the same time is inviting. Kind of horror. I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't have a question. I'm just going. I mean, maybe we should bring in Donoso's personal story and kind of, why would you perpetrate this? What is it that you're needing to work through that leads this to be the form in which you need to ask your questions?
Yeah, I mean, Donoso in many places talks about this book as a form of expiation. And he talks about these pains that he had, starting from when he was a child. When he was a teenager, he feigned stomach pains to get out of doing sports at school. And he says, that was my first disguise. That was my first fiction. And then when he grew up and he started to write, every time he tried to write, those pains came back and they became real. And there's a scene that he talks about in his diaries, which incidentally, I think his diaries, we can talk about them as scenes because he was very aware that people are going to read them. And this to me seems like a very constructed scene. But he talks about how, they had gone to Barcelona, he had spent years trying to write this book, and he couldn't do it. And he decided, he ran out of money. He said, I'm just going to burn it all. And his wife, Maria Pilar, stopped him. She said, no, if you don't write it, the book is gonna stay inside you and it's gonna tear you apart. So he didn't burn it and he kept writing it. And that's when he went, because he had run out of money, he had to go to Fort Collins, and that's when he had to have the surgery, and that's when he kind of had his breakthrough. So, I think that to him, this book is very tied to him physically, and every time he talks about the book, he talks about his own biography.
It's like a kind of symptom in a way, like a physical symptom.
Yes. Yeah, and he talks about how, to him, when he thinks about writing this book, it is very tied to the experience of illness and pain. And he says not all of his books are like that. There are others that he associates with pleasure. And so that's one thing, that it was a kind of expiation. Donoso himself was a very complicated man. He had a lot of self-doubt. And he had a lot of fear, like the paranoia that he talks about, I think was always with him. He had a lot of professional envy, but he also had some deep-seated fears related to poverty, related to just living in an ugly world.
Did he come from quite a poor background?
No.
Or he feared poverty rather than
He feared it. Yeah. There's in his diaries the figure of what he calls the clochard, the bum, the vagabond. It comes up over and over again. And
So
man,
the fear of falling down,
okay.
of the fear of kind of losing your grip and discovering that you're.
There's that, but he also has a fascination with the figure of the bum, of the vagabond, because he sees it, and there are several times where he mentions it in this book, where he talks about the freedom of being nothing and having nothing, and so he's fascinated with that. Like if you're not trying to be anything, it's like a letting go. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here for a second, if you'll allow me. But he also talks about how there was a time when he and a friend were driving home one night, and they ran over a bum who he was drunk and he had no ID on him, and they killed him. And they took his body to the police, and they couldn't figure out who it was. And the way he tells this is after that, he went home and he told his Nana about it, who is this figure in his life who embodied the earth and poor people. And, she never learned how to read. He told her about what had happened, and she broke down in tears and said, "I have a brother who left home many years ago. We never knew what happened
kind of
to
Greek
him."
tragedy level.
Yeah.
So
And he felt when he describes this, he says, "And my Nana, who had never learned to read, and to this day I don't understand how, she lived in our house and she was so smart, and we never taught her to read. And I felt guilty about that. I had to live with that guilt." And he doesn't talk about the guilt for killing the guy.
One gets transferred onto
Yeah. So to me, like you really see how like all of this stuff gets transferred onto this figure of the Nana, who is both the old women in the casa, who is Inez as she gets old. Well, who is the Nana, the witch Nana who teaches in the myth. She turns into all of these. She's both the good and the evil.
Because there's an extraordinary kind of, I don't know, like a kind of proximity to these old women in early parts of the book. Like you're taken into their very abject living situations, and they're all and it's very notable that they're full of packages and wrapped things, and these women are living kind of in the midst of junk, but everything is kind of inside stuff and carefully wrapped up in rags, and you'll find a few pins, or you'll find a few, and their bodies are much the same. There's a whole, I mean, there's some very strange transpositions go on at the point where one of the orphans has been, going about with men. I mean, we can talk more about that, but there's a pregnancy, but kind of like weirdness, and old lady ends up as the baby, and just sort of just nasty.
I feel a need to clarify here, because I feel like if you have not read this book and you hear us talking about it, you're going to have an idea of the book that it's very vague and crazy. But the genius of this book is that as you're reading it, it does adhere to its own internal logic. And it is readable. Like the way that we're talking about it makes it seem like it's not readable. But I promise
I mean, if you're like a Marquez fan and you like going to Seeing Eyes for the first time, all that kind of pleasures of what gets called magical realism is in here. I mean, there is storytelling and there are extraordinary flights of imagination.
It is not without humor.
And it's funny. It is very compelling, but it is dark.
Yeah,
and
it's pretty dark.
I think
it gets pretty grotesque.
There's a kind of proximity to abjection and disgust all the time that is not there in some other lighter works of the Latin American boom. But I mean it's storytelling. I mean it's not a kind of metaphysical abstractions. It's very physical. It's very tactile. It's very sensory.
It's very voice oriented.
Yeah. I don't know. At times it reminded me of Mervyn Peake Gormenghast. Those books. There's another place with the kind of complicated it's a fantastical castle where there are back corridors and various kind of strange shambling folk. And the other book I thought of was Fuentes' Terra Nostra, which has this kind of the Escorial and a kind of hallucinatory.
So Fuentes was one of the most important influences for this book, because when he was starting to write this book, he was reading Fuentes, first of all, Carpentier, La Casa Verde, the greenhouse, and some Cortázar, but not Rayuela. But it's really interesting how he talks about it, because he was reading all of those books and he was fascinated with the playfulness and the experimentation. But when he sat down to write, he said, I'm not like those guys. I want to write a simple, straightforward fable. And that was his original idea with this book, which is amazing.
It's kind of hilarious.
Yes, it really is. But you can see. But he was fascinated with those books. He talks about how reading Fuentes changed the way he thought about.
I was a bit confused. I mean, Fuentes was a classmate I read somewhere.
Oh yeah. So Donoso went to the
Santiago.
Grange School in Santiago, which is a very Shishi English language school, and he met Fuentes when he was a kid.
Amazing.
Because I'm not sure why, but I think he was maybe a diplomat's son.
Because he was
Yeah, somebody here knows
that. I know
that.
he was a diplomat. I mean, he did that thing of being the kind of cultural attaché in all sorts of places.
Right. Yeah, so they met as kids, and then they re-met again as adults, and they all coincided in Barcelona, and they were all friends, and yeah. So can I go down a little?
Go.
Okay. So there's another thing that he talks about where they were all in Barcelona together. They went to dinner with the Cortázars, the Vargas Llosases, the Fuenteses. So three of them, and him and his wife. So they went to this restaurant and they all sat down, and it was one of these restaurants where you have to write down what your order is. And so they sat down and they all started talking, and they were ignoring, and the place was going to close. And finally the owner came over and stood at their table and loudly asked, "Doesn't anyone here know how to write?" I really loved that anecdote.
I suppose we should talk about the diaries and about his daughter and this kind of extra layer of darkness and strangeness that veils this book.
Right. Yeah. So his daughter Pilar. So I don't even know where to start with that question. But one important thing in the life of Donoso and his wife, Maria Pilar, was that they couldn't have kids. And she really wanted to. She felt like she wasn't good enough. She couldn't give him a child. So they adopted Pilar in Spain. And Donoso was a great father in some respects. He was very close to his daughter. He taught her a lot of great things. He was her intellectual guide. And he told her that he wanted her to write his biography. He told many people he wanted them to write his biography, but one of those people was his daughter. And he left all of his papers were at Princeton. He left them in Princeton, and he left instructions that no one could read them until 10 years after his death. So she did that. 10 years after his death, she opened up the archives and wrote his biography. And it is devastating, and it is a beautiful, beautiful book.
And it's not translated.
It's not translated. It's called Correr el tupido velo. And she quotes a lot from the diaries. She was very horrified by what she found in those diaries, because he said a lot of negative things about her, about his daughter, things that she hadn't known he was thinking. And he got very paranoid towards the end, and she was in charge of his finances, and he thought she was stealing from him, and he questioned her life choices, and he said a lot of mean things about her, and he had done nothing to prepare her for reading this. So she wrote this biography, which is really beautiful. One of the things that was in his diary was an idea for a novel. And the idea for the novel was this. A writer dies, his daughter reads the diary, and finds out something terrible about her father. We never find out what it is, what that terrible thing is. But the daughter decides she can't live with it, and she kills herself. That's the idea for the novel, and that is what happened in real life. She wrote that biography and then soon after killed herself. It's just I know the story and it gives me chills to say it. I mean, it's just astonishing.
I mean, everybody who's read that book says it's an extraordinary book. I mean, do you know if there's any chance that we'll ever be put English? Is it something you would
depends
do?
On how well this
goes. Buy a copy and then,
it's very specific. In some ways it's very specific because I would assume that you would have to be interested in the José Donoso, but it is also really good literature.
Story,
yeah. So maybe it does have a broader appeal.
It'd be interesting to know if there was a publishing possibility for that. I'm so curious.
Yeah. So then, some people would question what is the thing, what is the secret, and some people would say that secret is his sexuality. But I think that probably his sexuality was a little bit of a surprise to his daughter, but not to anyone who knew him. He had a complicated sexuality. He wasn't entirely heterosexual. He was married. To my sights, it seems like he had a very codependent relationship with his wife, but they were very close in some ways. They also were terrible to each other. But they loved each other in their own way. And, he had affairs with men, but not even that much. And she knew about it.
For that's not an adequate explanation for this.
Yeah, no. I think that it's more than that. It's that Donoso, for whatever reason, he always had this feeling that deep down he was dirty. He was contaminated. And I don't know why he felt like that, And I think that's a lot of what he's dealing with here.
Yeah, for sure.
But he always had this fear of being not good enough, this fear of being contaminated. And it's not a rational thing, And it's not about his sexuality. It's about a lot of things. And I think it's more tied up with his fear of not being a good enough writer than his fear than anything to do with his sexuality.
The bird of night is an obscene bird of night, isn't it? I mean, there is this constant drumbeat of disgust and what you call body horror now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that makes it a kind of quite interesting but for now, in that there are so many people who are interested in that kind of exploration of physicality and the body as a theoretical kind of category, and having this book kind of come into the conversation now, I think it is a good moment for it, and it is an interesting time for it to kind of turn up. I mean, we're hard up against the moment when I can kind of open it up to the audience. But I was just wanting to say one more thing. Give us a sense of how he was, say, other Chilean writers since. Like how has he understood? I mean, Alejandro Zambra has written an introduction to this, which is very interesting, and there are some not altogether positive remarks by Bolaño.
Yeah. I mean, Bolaño has his reasons.
And Bolaño always twists the knife a little bit. I mean, his whole thing is...
I think he was kind of trying to...
cause some shit.
He was trying to cause some shit, for sure. He was trying to stir the pot or whatever metaphor you want to use. And I think that he was reacting more to the perception of Donoso, because, Donoso had this fear of not being good enough, but Donoso in his time in Chile was the writer. everyone knew who he was. He had a lot of success. He had a lot of disciples. He had, in his later years, he did writing workshops, and a lot of people who published had studied with Donoso. He was a mover and a shaker. And I think that Bolaño, who was not really part of that world, was kind of reacting more to that than the actual text.
Yeah, the writing workshops thing interesting because a lot of Bolaño's Distant Star has all these kind of writers' workshops, which kind of are
those
the
are a thing in
incubators
Chile, even today. Like they don't have creative writing MFAs, but you go and you take a workshop with a writer, and then that's
it's very much a cult of personality.
Kind of, yeah. Like I think people learn a lot in those workshops, but it's also kind of like you can drop that name. Yeah, and it's a group. And there was a group of writers called Los Donositos. Like they people who learned from him.
Amazing. We have some time for questions, and remember the people online who will need audio as well. So if you have a question, wait for the mic before asking. Although you don't, no one has questions.
You can just raise your hand and we'll come over to you with a mic.
I was wondering if there are certain novels that he considered antecedents to this novel or others of his?
Well, I don't know about antecedents, but like I say, he was reading these boom writers, and this book is definitely in conversation with those books. Carlos Fuentes, Carpentier, those kinds of books. One of the things that he mentions that to me was really interesting was he recalls going to the house of Marta Brunet in Chile and hearing something that horrified him, which was when she said, "Oh, I'm hearing from a lot of corners that you are the next realist writer, that you're the writer who's going to write about Chilean reality."
In a sort of social realist way, right?
Yeah, and he was horrified by that. But in a way, like if you look at the first chapter of this book, it could fit into some of that tradition, to the Manuel Rojas or Marta Brunet herself. It starts there and then it gets crazy. It spirals out. But I think that he felt that burden, and maybe he felt the presence of that kind of realist novel. And
let's invoke the very difficult magic realist term. I mean, it's obviously everyone's uncomfortable with that for different ways. But would you say that was the move? In some sense, that was the move beyond this social realism and a kind of tales of peasant life or whatever it would be, into a kind of psychological set of spaces or a kind of non-rational
set
of spaces?
What all the boom writers were trying to do was write about the society and their countries from outside. So in a way, they were writing a local story, but in a way that made sense on a global stage. And Donoso himself talks about how he had to get outside of Chile before he could write about it. He's very much talking about Chilean society here. I'm not sure about. I don't know that he was necessarily trying to write magical realism. I'm not sure what that.
I don't know what the magic part of it would be.
Yeah, I don't know if that term would have meant something to him. But they were definitely trying to make sense of their societies. And that's why in the translator's note, I talked about the Imbunte and how Edwards Bello, who was an older politician, writer in Chile, he wrote about Imbunchismo as the defining characteristic of Chile.
Oh, okay. So it was used in a metaphorical sense for a kind of being closed off?
Being closed off and this kind of unformed identity where, if you think about Spanish colonialism that kind of cut off the native, the local mythology, I guess. Chile itself is physically cut off from the world by the ocean, by the mountains, by the desert. And so he had this idea that there was this cult of the ugly, culto a lo feo, like this need to take something beautiful and twist it up and deform it. And it also has, there's something similar to this, to a scarcity mentality where, I mean, I'm jumping around here, but you know, how Donoso felt other people's success as his own failure. And that's something that's very true in Chile. You know, this, you know, I'm going to pull you down so I can get...
I was just at a residency with a bunch of people who live in Barcelona, and they were talking in a very similar way. I don't know if this is a this is a characteristic of
it is.
Of
I love Chile, but I think any Chilean would agree with me.
There's a lot of
it's called chaqueterismo, and it's like, yeah, it's definitely a characteristic. So that to me was really interesting because I don't think Donoso was thinking about that when he included that. But this book has it's really important to kind of solidify the idea of impuntismo as key for Chile.
Right. That's very interesting. That's something I hadn't understood about it. Any more questions? Is somebody there? No.
Can you talk a little bit about the translation process and if this project felt more elusive than others because of the slipperiness, or if translation felt, you know, on theme with transformation and transmutation, if that actually helped?
Yeah, thank you for that question because we should have talked about that before. So an important note here is that I did not do this translation. This is ultimately the foundation of this book is the translation that was published in 1970. It was done by Hardy St. Martin. It was revised by Leonard Mades. I came in to translate the 20 or so pages that were left out of that translation. So that was my first job here. Then my second job was to kind of update that translation, because there are some places where, while the Spanish it still sounds like kind of colloquial Spanish that you can hear in Chile today, the translation sometimes sounded a little outdated. So, you know, we kind of worked to update it a little bit, but this is not my translation. I did like a little bit of it. No, I mean, I spent a lot of time with it and I read a lot of it. I did make a fair amount of changes, but I also was very aware that this is someone else's translation and I don't want to mess it up. So even when there were things that I would have done differently, I was sometimes reluctant to make changes. You know. So, you know, I think that the whole writing and the translation publication process has been really interesting and complicated. But I think that I like to think of it as, you know, for Donoso, the voice was really important. He spent a long time getting the voice. And I think the translation has the voice. And I think that you can think of translation as just another mask on top of all the masks that are in this book, you know, all the layers. So, in terms of the slipperiness, I'm aware of this book as an important book. It's like important with a capital I. And I think that I was very aware of that, you know, and the fact that I couldn't talk to Donoso, I couldn't talk to St. Mades, like, I was reluctant to interfere too much. But I also felt like I wanted to get really deep into the diaries, into all of these other texts in order to kind of supplement my reading of this book, because that can kind of take the place of asking questions.
Somebody there in the aisle.
I'm just curious to hear more about, I guess, how this project got off the ground. Because as you noted, you had that previous translation, but it was incomplete. And that was published, you know, a while ago. And as you also noted, Donoso is not quite as well known as other figures of the Latin American boom. So just curious, how did this project come to be? Because I think it's great that we now have this unabridged version. But I was also surprised when I heard about it. It's like, oh, nobody really works on Donoso in the United States. There are not that many. Certainly not as many as Fuentes or Vargas Llosa or Cortázar, et cetera. So just curious about that.
I mean, sometimes those things happen. This book should be in print. It should be at New Directions. It's a perfect New Directions book. So the originally, and maybe you guys can fill in a little bit, but I was originally approached to translate another book that I'm working on now. That is another book by Donoso called "The Mysterious Disappearance of the Marquise of Luria," and it's a book that has never been published in English, and it has been really astonishing because it is crazy to think that the same guy wrote this book and that book. It's like it's an erotic novel set in early 20th century Spain. And it's real funny, kind of real lighthearted.
Wow.
It gets weird. It does get weird. but the voice is totally different. So I signed on to do that book. And then they got the rights to this book. And before I knew it, I was deep in this labyrinth.
Been embunted.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of like the behind the scenes, how does that project come about? That maybe I don't know. I think there's somebody here, right?
The pages that were left out. Please talk about those scenes, and I apologize if you did already, because in other publications, the pages that are left out have been some of the more problematic or difficult or really disturbing elements, and then they're included posthumously from the author or from the editors who decided to take them out. So I'm interested in that aspect, but then also the translation, really getting into elements of Spanish that maybe don't translate directly into English, and how you handled or tried to stride in and make it, was there an effort to make it seamless as the reader moves through and now has these pages that have been left out?
So the things that were left out are the things that I have mentioned. Those there was a lot of the scenes in the hospital, the medical paranoia. There were the scenes of the Swiss chalet and Castro, mentions of Castro, and a lot of the kind of scenes with the monsters and the kind of finery and trappings of their world.
I mean, early 70s, you would have thought that kind of in the US mentioning Castro would be kind of a selling point, maybe. I mean, he was
right.
topical.
I think that it's really interesting to speculate on why they took these things out, why they wanted to take these things out. I think it always will have to do with the specific editors who were working on it, and they were editing, and they thought there was a reason. They thought those things were unnecessary.
Because it's not as if they attempted to reduce this text in length in any really significant way.
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
It's not that many
It's not
pages,
that much,
so it's not like we've got a sprawling book. Our audience will only deal
Right.
with,
It's important
cleaner...
to note that this was a negotiation, it seems like.
Right.
So the editors wanted to cut a lot. They wanted to cut whole
Right,
sections.
right.
And Donoso said, no, but we can cut some things.
So he kind of threw him a few bones, essentially.
Yeah,
and
that's my impression.
Yeah.
And so it was a negotiation.
How you work with editors.
Right. And I think that, to me, it seems key that I don't think Donoso ever read he didn't read the final version that was going to be printed before it was printed.
He did, I heard, put a note in claiming that saying that the text in English is slightly different, and that this would be somehow these changes would be reincorporated into a future edition of the Spanish text.
Yeah, and that was, I think, at the request of the editors. And he said, I've made some changes in this English edition that will be reflected in later versions of the Spanish, or later printings of the Spanish. And that did not happen. So this book has been in print in Spanish ever since then, and he didn't do that. Why? Either he was too lazy and never got around to it, but it does not go with Donoso's personality. I think if he really wanted those cuts to be made, he would have made them, or he didn't really mean that note. And those cuts were reflected in a couple of the other translations, maybe like German or French. But most of the other translations didn't reflect that.
And we have time for one more question from our virtual audience, which is, are there any commentaries from the disability community on this book?
I mean, not that I know of, but give it a minute. I mean, it was a different time. And I think that you have to give him a little bit the benefit of the doubt and look at the project as he...
But also there is something quite radical about a world where the notion of normal is inverted. I mean, this kind of walled garden where the monsters are normal and the non-monster is the monster, because Umberto is received as a monster. So I mean, from that point of view, there's certainly something quite fruitful, I think, in terms of interrogating social standards for physical beauty and so on.
I think you could definitely say that he is in a way fetishizing the bodies of the people in La Rinconada in this, but he's also fetishizing the body of Inez and the old crone, and
he's fetishizing all the bodies.
As Coitia, Geronimo, there's the whole plot where they can only have sex when Murito is watching them. He fetishizes this beautiful couple. He fetishizes what he sees as, he also fetishizes a little bit the old woman, because she goes back and he switches back and forth between Inez, who is this young beautiful girl, and her Nana, who is this old crone, and they kind of are interchangeable.
We haven't even got into the giant, the papier-mâché head.
We have not.
The giant. And
you guys still have some surprises waiting for you in this book.
And with that, thanks all for coming out, and thank you so much for
Thank you.
What a pleasure.
Thank you both so much. Thank you all so much for coming. Let's move out into the bookstore, buy copies of the book, grab a drink at the cafe. We'll move them out there too if you have more questions or want to chat. Thanks for coming.